great to be here. Thank you for having me on stage today and talk about a subject where a lot of people talk about, but a lot of people actually don't really understand how it works, and that has something to do with governance and something to do with blockchain, and obviously it's all decentralized and computer arranged, etc. And I'm here to shed a little light in that perspective. So I'm going to talk about effective blockchain and DAO governance, and that's for a specific reason. This is just a brief summary of my CV, and the reason that I'm allowed to talk about this subject is that I'm currently doing a PhD research towards effective governance models of decentralized autonomous organizations on public permissionless blockchains, and why DAOs on public permissionless blockchains. I'll come down to that at the end of this presentation, why there is a clear need, especially in this area. So let's start with the presentation, because we got quite a lot of ground to cover for the 15 minutes that I officially have, and I'm very good in overstepping my time. So be prepared in this regards. What is the biggest problem with blockchain governance? What is the biggest problem? Sorry? No, not the scalability, that's the technical part. No, the biggest problem to start with is actually that we're talking about two container terms. We are still talking about the thing that blockchain is one thing, while blockchain is not one thing. We have so many different kind of blockchains with different structures and setups and collaborations that we can't approach blockchain as being one single solution. Every solution in itself has its own hurdles that they have to go through. And the second container term we're dealing with is the term governance, because I'm guessing that there are around 100 and 150 people around here. If I would go around and ask every one of you what you think governance means, I will get about 250 opinions. Because everybody thinks something a bit different about governance and something different about blockchain. So this is the first problem we have to tackle. So I'll come down to blockchain in a second. Let's start out with the governance part. What is governance? And let's start out with a definition of what governance is. And the most quoted definition in the world is a definition by Professor Wall, who stated in 2004 that it represents a framework of decision rights, accountabilities, incentives, encourage desired behavior in scarce resource, etc. After reading this a few times, I was still a bit puzzled what he meant. So together with a couple of other people, we sat down, what is the essence of governance? And the essence of governance in the end is nothing more than how we coordinate and execute actions and decisions in any system. And the problem is that any system has a life cycle, and during its life cycle, this coordination and the execution of decisions and actions is different in every stage of the life cycle, because we coordinate things totally different in a design and execute things in a design than in an operational stage, than in a evolvement stage. And if we're in a crisis, we're also in an evolvement stage, but then your time horizon is just a bit shorter. That's basically what it comes down to. So when we talk about governance, you have to be very specific in which stage your project is, and also are we talking about the coordination of the execution. But we can have loads of discussions around governance and what is the most effective setup of governance systems, etc. But what is the most interesting time, or to my point of view, actually the only time that governance is really interesting? Governance is really interesting only when we talk about who is responsible and how can we perform an action if shit hits the fan. Because if everything runs smoothly, nobody cares who approved a certain decision, and nobody cares who's next in the process if it operates. Only if shit hits the fan, if something goes wrong, then all of a sudden governance becomes interesting. Because we have to be able to act, and we have to know who is responsible. And that we have to know who's able to act and who is responsible or accountable even. This is where within blockchain this might become fuzzy. Because if we talk about blockchain and governance, what is the first thing that comes into mind with most of the people? It's the so-called consensus mechanism. It is all automated by all the computers making the decisions all together instead of how it really is. Because we have to tear two things apart. And we have to start talking about governance by the ecosystem and of a governance of the infrastructure. And governance by the infrastructure is basically approving transactions, checking transactions, and execution of smart contract code. So the code that we deployed on a blockchain in itself. And yes, this part is automated through consensus mechanisms. And there's not only one consuming all the energy in the world, proof of work, there are multiple of them. And I'll show you a picture later on. But what is equally interesting, and it was already Primavera de Filippi who mentioned this in 2015, but for some reason she didn't get all the attention you needed to have on this part, is the second part, the governance of the infrastructure. And this is, for some reason, the best hidden secret for a lot of people in the blockchain world. Or at least the least spoken of in the general audience, because we tend to talk all the time about how we execute a transaction and how we execute smart contract code, but you hear little discussion in the broader audience. Within our community you hear it, but outside the community is how we deal with updates of the software in itself, of the updates of the system in itself. And there is a big misconception that this is completely decentralized, because that's one of the arguments that you hear all the time. We're living in a decentralized world and everybody has an equal vote, etc. So it's a completely new system that we're working in. But if we deep dive a little bit further, you will see on the left-hand side, these are all the consensus mechanisms, and there are many more. I described around 20 here, but there are many more. But on the right-hand side, this is a completely different process. And we distinguish two main areas, the so-called off-chain governance process and the on-chain governance process. The on-chain governance process is really early stage, hardly any big examples of really effective on-chain governance systems for the update of software. Most of the time it's a off-chain governance process, meaning nothing to do with anything online. It's an informal process that nobody really described how we deal with software updates. And I can best illustrate you this based on an example that happened last year. Because we tend to make very important decisions around this word decentralization. And one of the most important decisions was taken, for example, by the SEC, who stated that because of decentralization and a few other things, Bitcoin and Ethereum ought to be cryptocurrencies and not securities. This is literally the words from the chairman of the SEC. They said it's sufficiently decentralized so there's no party on top of the system who can make a decision, because it's equally amongst all the nodes in the network and there are thousands of them. That was basically their philosophy behind it. But I don't know how many of you have heard of the Bitcoin inflation bug of September last year? Anybody? No? That's why it's one of those best kept secrets in the industry. September last year, a core developer, and don't pinpoint me on this one, from either Bitcoin Cash or Bitcoin, found out that the core software of Bitcoin contained a bug. And did you know what the bug contained? The problem was that a miner would be able to print as many Bitcoins as they wanted, kind of undermining the system completely from scratch. So if the miners would have found out, they could have used this bug in order to print as many Bitcoins for themselves and basically killing Bitcoin at once. So what happened at that point was, from a research perspective, also with the governance part, quite interesting, because it didn't have anything to do with the left-hand side, fully automated. No, we're talking on the right-hand side over here. So what happened there? This group of this core developer called the other core developers and said, hey guys, we have to sit down together and we have to write a fix, because if somebody finds out, Bitcoin is gone, and it will be gone overnight. So they did. They sat together, and Angela Walsh did a research towards that, and she figured out that at most 12 people knew of this bug at that point in time, because they were working on the solution. And after being in a room for 2 days working on the solution, they posted this solution under another update that was already planned in the network, without mentioning what kind of update this was. So that is one. So they actually posted this software update and said it to the community, hey, can you please install it? But to make sure that it was installed at a sufficient speed. They also called the CEO of one of the biggest mining pools in the world to make sure that he would install it within 20 minutes of the release of the software. So literally, we had a critical bug undermining the complete system, and without notifying the whole world, 12 people decided to write an update and to secretly place this under another update mechanism, and it was updated within 20 minutes. And as one of the largest mining pools in the world went, the rest went as well, because it was ought to be a minor bug fix. And only 2 days later, they announced to the world that it had a major bug in it. So there was a group of 12 people who could actually push through a software update in the system. And don't get me wrong, it's not an attack on how this off-chain process works, but don't come to me saying, hey, it's a countervailing power, we have the core developers and all the miners are checking the core developers. They clearly didn't. And in this case, it was for the good, because it was really, really undermining the system if the people would have found out about this bug. But if they can do it for the good, they can obviously do it for the bad as well. That's always the case. So my argument here is, in a lot of cases, yes, maybe the governance of the operations side, the left-hand side, is decentralized, but with regards to update of the system, and that is changing the core software, that is not decentralized at all. It's not a democracy at all. It is, at best, I think, an aristocracy, where a few people together can make a decision for the bigger group. Or in some cases, and that's the most funny part of it all, they all want to design new governance models. And if we look at, for example, the on-chain governance models, most of them look like constitutions of big countries. So they literally copied the political systems that are already in place. So this with regards to governance by the system and governance of the system. Some things you have to really take apart. But if you work on a blockchain project yourself, is this the only part where we can implement governance in itself? No, of course not. We do have a lot of discussion around the infrastructure governance models, but that's not the only place where you can set the rules for your system, your project, etc. Because in the application in itself, you can build a lot of rules as well. So you don't have to be completely dependent on the governance layer of the infrastructure. And it's not very handy to be completely dependent on the governance layer of the infrastructure sector. And this is just the technical governance side. Because on your company level, the non-technical side, you can also build in a lot of structures. I think the best example there is, in a year and a half ago, this CEO of this exchange in Canada died in India. We still don't know if he really died, but with him, the access to the private key and 160 million in funds was gone. And at that point in time, you heard a lot of people saying, hey, we need new governance models for key recovery on a protocol level, or we need extra rules and regulations in order to make sure that this can't happen anymore. While the easiest solution would have been not to keep a private key with access to 160 million in funds with one person only, but say we have to have 3 people within the company who have a copy of the key. That is maybe the easiest implementation. And that's the funny part. We tend to have a lot of discussions around we need new governance models of blockchains in itself, or we need real new rules and regulations, while that in itself is the least influential part. If you build blockchain projects, you can build in your own rules and and systems into the application in itself and on your company level. And that is directly influential by itself. There is one place, though, where blockchain is completely different with regards to governance in comparison to traditional applications. And that is due to the fact that what is the most used governance action if something is wrong in your application? What do we do? If something is wrong in your application, what do? You take it offline, you change it a bit and put it online again. That's basically what you do. Yeah? And this is kind of impossible now because we have a very high or extreme entanglement between application and infrastructure. If we build an application on blockchain, especially if it's partly deployed on a blockchain in itself, it's really, really hard to change the code if you didn't think it through up front. if not impossible in a lot of cases. But if we deep dive in a little bit more into it, is it then impossible to have traditional governance models on top of blockchain projects? No, but because for the first argument in this one is there is no one blockchain, actually where I started. And the biggest denominator within blockchain land is always, are we building on a permission blockchain or a permissionless blockchain? And I know the Bitcoin and the Ethereum maximalists are arguing that permission blockchains are not real blockchains, but if we look at real life implementation, 90% of them are implemented on permission blockchains at the moment. And if it's a permission blockchain and we look at governance structures, all the traditional governance structures that we know can be applied to permission blockchains because they come very close to a shared database in a joint venture construction. And we've been dealing with shared database and joint venture constructions for years already. That's nothing new out there. We might have new questions, and I explicitly say might because we just don't know if they're truly new questions or that we can apply current governance models in the permissionless space, but we might have new questions there. And then we come to the application in themselves, and we tend to see blockchain applications as one thing, while blockchain applications can be split in three main kinds. We have the direct transactional applications, the so-called conditional transactional applications, and the decentralized autonomous organizations. And the direct transactional applications are applications like wallet software. And yes, the result of an action of a wallet software will be recorded on a blockchain, but the software of the wallet in itself is not in the blockchain at all. It's on centralized servers. If something is wrong in the software there, you can change something, push through an update, and then move on. So the left-hand side, there's no problem with traditional governance models to put it up there. It becomes a little bit more complicated if part of your application runs on code with smart contracts. And then we call it conditional transactional applications. And it becomes even more fuzzy when we move towards the so-called decentralized autonomous organization. And from a technical point of view, these are basically the same because they're just a bunch of smart contracts. Also, a decentralized autonomous organization are a bunch of smart contracts. The biggest difference between this one and that one is the fact that we don't always know who's behind it anymore, and the user base and the owner base can be extremely fluid. Somebody can be part of a decentralized autonomous organization and get out of it a few minutes later. So here is where we might come up with new governance questions in itself. So if we put this in a nice color-coded area again, we see that most of the questions are here on the right-hand side. And especially this one is quite interesting because I think parity, for example, is a really nice example of a conditional transactional application. Take, for example, well, both the parity 1 and the parity 2 incident. If you're not familiar with it, Google it, please. But something went horribly wrong, losing a lot of funds, basically 2 times. The first time it was 30 million that we lost, and the second time around $160 million that we lost. And in both cases, for some reason, nobody was held responsible for the loss. While there was a clear company who built the application, being Parity, who built the multi-sig wallet in the first place, and if we go back to what governance is all about, if shit hits the fan, we want to hold somebody responsible. And if there's a company like Parity behind it, we could theoretically just hold them responsible for the software that they deployed. And the argument that they deployed it on a permissionless blockchain in itself isn't a very valid argument to dodge accountability in the end. That is something you have to keep in mind. So taking the different layers and the stages in mind, yeah, give me 3 more minutes and then I'm ready, I think. And we really have the true new questions with DAOs on public permissionless blockchains. In all other situations, so if we use permission blockchains or other types of applications than DAOs, we can apply governance structures and governance models that we already used for years. I'm not saying it's an easy task because you have to set up JV constructions. You have to set up clear rules of cooperation between a lot of different parties, but it's not something new out there. And I want to make sure that everybody in the industry goes beyond the point saying, hey, everything we do is completely new, so old things don't apply, which is completely not true. Old things do apply in a lot of cases. That brings me to the DAO governance structures in itself, and also here we can distinguish the governance in or by the DAO in itself, and the governance of the DAO in itself. And now we really come into uncharted territory because there are not too many live examples out there. There's one great live example out there that went horribly wrong. That is the DAO, the most used piece of research right now. And with initiatives like Colony and MakerDAO and etc. coming up, we do get more material to study actually. But if we take a look at the governance by the DAO or in the DAO, there's basically three main areas. Completely business ruled, so completely automated decisions, or we make decisions through various voting mechanisms or multi-sig decisions that upfront so many people have to agree and that's it. So not a voting system in itself. These are the three main areas. But that's all about the operational activity of the DAO. So are we allowed to spend money, etc. But hardly any discussion, and it is, I think, someone from Estonia, Lau, he's a researcher from Estonia, who actually said one of the most important things, and he said it during it was in Berlin, the DAO event last year. I'll come down to the name later. But he said, one of the things that we hardly think about by setting up DAOs is we need rules to change the rules. In other words, we need governance of the DAO. And again, this is very little practical use cases. We do see now that DAOs become more used because we have parameterized DAOs, but they are often fixed in business rules. That means that you can set up your own DAO just by filling in a few parameters, hitting OK, and it's deployed automatically on the background. So you don't have to put in business rules anymore. And maybe you can change these parameters, and these parameters are 20% needs to vote or 25% need to vote, etc. But the rules in itself are not changeable because that's completely fixed. And that all boils down to the simple fact that these are things that are built with smart contracts. And one of the key challenges that we still run into in this area is that smart contract code update is something that isn't really thought through yet in a lot of cases. We are experimenting with proxy functions in smart contracts so we can update it, or with self-destruct functions and then deploying a new one, etc. But upgrading smart contracts, in other words, changing the rules, is something that is really hard. And it's hard for a reason, because we kind of invented it, that it can't be changed. So that is the problem that we run into. And one of the main problems also, and that goes for the governance of the DAO and the governance in the DAO, is what we see is after initial enthusiasm, we see a declining voter base. Or in other words, in the beginning, everybody wants to have a say in a DAO. Yeah, we were going to go left, we're going to go right. And after a year or so, nobody cares. So if you set up a decentralized organization where all the shareholders must vote all the time, please bear in mind that 90% of them don't care after a year to vote. So don't set your voting threshold too high, because you could run into problems. But if you set it too low, then there's too much power for a single person. So this is the balance you have to find. And that brings me to the last slide, and that is, what is effective governance then? Or what is effective then? And that is a very... Yeah, I'm sorry I have to give this answer. There is no right or wrong answer. What is effective? It all comes down to a lot of decisions that you want to make yourself. Can we do an update frequently? Do we do an update once every year or every day, for example? Do we want to have a rollback function for some kind of sort? Do we want to have information equality, for example, that everybody knows what an update is about, because the update is not only written in code but also in formal language, so any non-coder can understand the code update as well. But other things, can we make different decisions for different questions? For example, if it regards an economic update, only half the people have to vote, and if it's a fundamental update, everybody needs to vote. These kind of decisions. And also, how many people do we even want to vote? Because yes, we are all dreaming about perfect democracies, but in a lot of cases, and again, governance becomes interesting when shit hits the fan and you want to make a decision in 2 minutes. And I don't think that letting the whole world decide on a decision and you only have 2 minutes is the most effective mean to do so. Maybe you want to have 1 or 2 persons who are allowed to push something through at a point in time. So the very sad answer actually is, it's all in the eye of the beholder, taking into account the purpose, the surrounding, and the goals of the solutions that we are building on top of the technology in itself. This was a little bit more about blockchain governance, and I hope that you have any questions, but ask them afterwards. I'll be here all day. Yeah? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Oliver.